Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating sequence of events, something that almost sounds like a modern fable, but actually represents a very real, very complex political shift. We're going to look into the recent developments surrounding what's been dubbed the Cockroach Party and how exactly it connects to the phenomenon we know as the Nepali upheaval. If you've been following the news at all, you know trying to understand the mechanics behind these sudden power shifts can be, well, incredibly confusing. But today, we're going to make it crystal clear. So, how exactly did a so-called cockroach party shake up an entire nation? Usually, when we talk about major national upheavals, it is so easy to get bogged down in dense political jargon. The endless acronyms, historical grievances, parliamentary procedures. It's exhausting, right? So for this explainer, we're just stripping all of that away. We're going to look at how a seemingly fringe group managed to fundamentally shake up an entire nation's structure by focusing on a really simple, straightforward story. Which brings us to Section 1, Meet Our Stickman. To truly grasp these recent developments, we're using an everyday citizen as our proxy. Just imagine our stickman lives in a house, and that house represents the broader political and social landscape of the country. It's the system literally everyone relies on. But lately, things aren't looking so great. The foundation is showing some serious, undeniable cracks. The structural integrity, the traditional rules and norms that kept the country stable for decades, is visibly wearing down. Our stickman is worried, obviously, but mostly just trying to ignore the drafts and the creaking floors. The thing is, ignoring it doesn't make the cracks go away. It just leaves them empty and waiting to be filled. Moving into Section 2, the Cockroach Party explained. Because in any ecosystem, whether we're talking biology or politics, a void doesn't just stay empty for long. And that brings us directly to the concept of the Cockroach Party. Now, we can understand this group not through those dense political terms we want to avoid, but simply as unexpected elements that move in, adapt, and absolutely thrive whenever a system's foundation begins to weaken. The name might sound a bit shocking, but think about the core characteristics of a cockroach. They are highly resilient, capable of surviving in the harshest conditions, and able to navigate the narrowest, darkest spaces that everyone else entirely ignores. In our stickman's country, this political entity did exactly that. They found the neglected, cracking spaces in the society's foundation, moved right in, and made it their own. So let's compare the two. On one side, our stickman is used to the old system. This older system was highly predictable. The foundation was solid, everyone knew where the walls were, and change happened very slowly. But on the flip side, the Cockroach Party system operates by a completely different set of rules. It thrives literally because of the cracks. It rapidly multiplies its influence by navigating the broken parts of the system, and it is highly, almost frighteningly adaptable. Suddenly, our stickman isn't just dealing with a creaky floorboard anymore, they're dealing with a totally new force that's fundamentally rewriting how the house operates from the ground up. Section 3. What is the upheaval? Now, the absolutely crucial point here is figuring out what happens to the house when those adaptable elements keep multiplying. Because this progression definitely doesn't happen overnight. First, we have the beginning, those initial ignored cracks where the new party first takes root. Then, the pressure mounts over time until we hit the tipping point. This is that moment of maximum tension, right? Where the old foundation is so compromised by the new occupants that the structure simply cannot hold its original shape anymore. And finally, that tension snaps, propelling us into the third phase, the upheaval. In our story, the Nepali upheaval isn't just some abstract political crisis or a boring headline. It is the literal, physical moment our stickman's house abruptly and violently shifts on its weakened foundation. Imagine sitting in your living room and suddenly the floor tilts 15 degrees. Everything you own slides to one side. The doors don't fit the frames anymore. That is the upheaval. It's a sudden, undeniable realignment of the entire political reality. The house hasn't completely collapsed, sure, but it's standing in a drastically different, much more precarious way. Section 4. Connecting party to upheaval. Because we can't just look at the shifting house and the thriving party as two separate incidents. We have to ask how one led to the other. And we can see the direct link through 3 really clear steps. It's basically a chain reaction. Step 1. The party doesn't actually create the initial problems. They just emerge and capitalize on the existing cracks that the old system ignored. Step 2, because they operate differently and multiply their influence within those vulnerabilities, their very presence weakens the traditional structure even further. The old foundation just wasn't built to sustain that kind of internal pressure. And step 3, that combined pressure, the original cracks, plus the expanding influence of the new party within them, ultimately triggers the structural shift.
The upheaval is the unavoidable physical consequence of steps 1 and 2.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Why This Matters Today. As we wrap up this explainer, we need to step out of the past and look at what this means right now.
The biggest takeaway here is that the old normal is just gone. First, the house has fundamentally shifted. You can't simply push it back into its original position. Second, our stickman, who represents the everyday citizens, remember, must now adapt to living on a slanted floor. They have to learn entirely new ways to navigate their own home. And third, maybe most importantly, the cockroach party is no longer an anomaly hiding in the dark. Actually, scratch that, they aren't hiding at all anymore. By filling the cracks and surviving the upheaval, they're now a permanent load-bearing part of the new structure. The house relies on them just as much as it relies on whatever is left of the old concrete.
Ultimately, looking at this incredibly adaptable party and the newly shifted landscape they helped create, we're left with one fascinating, absolutely critical question about the future of the Nepali upheaval. Will the citizens, our stickman, find a way to entirely rebuild a new, solid foundation from scratch? Or is this slanted, cracked, highly adaptable new dynamic just the way the house stands now? It is a classic question of resilience versus acceptance, and the answer to that will absolutely define the next chapter of their history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on how that foundation continues to settle.